Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. September is Emergency Preparedness Month, and here's the question. If disaster struck tonight, would you and your family be ready? Well, 20 years after Hurricane Katrina, the images and lessons are still with us. And now, with cuts to agencies like FEMA and those we count on to forecast the storms, the stakes feel even higher. Tonight, our panel of experts will give us the tools, steps, and knowledge to protect your family, your home, and your peace of mind before the next emergency hits. My guests are Dr. Anel Prim, co-founder and chair of All Healers Mental Health Alliance, Joe Gilliam, founder of Unity in Disasters Incorporated, and Dr. Gulda Downer, founder of the HBCU Emergency Management Workforce Consortium. Thank you all so much for taking the time to talk to us about this really important issue. Now, before we get into emergency preparedness, I want to start with each of you to kind of define your role when it prepares our communities for disasters. Specifically, what is it that you do and how do you get it done? Gulda, I'll start with you.
Harold, thank you. Thanks so much for this. You know, when a disaster strikes, sometimes it's during that time that our community who are victims of the disaster become even more marginalized because the people coming in to support them have no clue. Our workforce then needs to reflect the community in which the disaster has occurred. And our goal at the Emergency Management Workforce Consortium, that was co-founded by myself and two other colleagues, is to strengthen the pipeline of emergency managers who can go into our community and provide the resources we need in a culturally and linguistically supported manner. That's the primary goal.
When you say strengthen the pipeline, particularly as relates to culturally and linguistically, what do you mean?
Well, the data shows, and when we look at our diversity index, that we don't have enough people of color in that field. Researcher Platt showed that in a disaster, the more fierce and dramatic the disaster is, that the more the white emergency managers provided resources for their own people of white people and people of color. The research shows it. So diversity means the humility, the broad spectrum of the breadth of culture to make sure that the services are equitably delivered. We don't want people coming into the community when the disaster is still raging, leave, and we're still sitting in it. We need people who understand us and can meet us where we are. And that's what's important.
I'm looking forward to drilling down a little bit more on that, particularly considering this 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, but we will get to that later in the conversation. Joe, same question. What is it that your organization does? Joe?
So thanks for having us. But Unity in Disasters, what we do strategically partner with agencies to identify neighborhoods with unmet needs. That's key because you have to know who to help. And once we identify, then we can tap into our resources and our donors and give them the story saying, this is why we need the support. This is why we need the funding. And then we go into those marginalized communities and help people at that point. It's hard to determine that at the very front end because the situation is fluid and you're at the beginning, you just look at one group of people that are in need. You don't realize who is self-sufficient and who is not. You have to double down into those neighborhoods to identify that. And that's what we do. We try to address the gaps in service, which is part of our mission statement.
And now, same question.
Yes, thank you for having us for this conversation. The All Healers Mental Health Alliance is an organization formed immediately after Hurricane Katrina to facilitate culturally appropriate responses to the mental health needs of marginalized communities, in particular Black communities, affected by all types of disaster, whether they be natural or human caused. And, just picking up on what both my colleagues have said, because of some of the challenges that our communities face, even before the disaster, we recognize there's going to be a lot of stress and trauma, additional stress and trauma that the disaster brings. And when our communities get neglected and bypassed in terms of resources and supports, we want to be there along with Joe Gilliam and Dr. Gulda Downer to ensure that those communities get what they need. And so All Healers has helped the mental health of communities by being that interface and that connector to make sure that people know that communities have needs. Sometimes they're suffering in silence. And so we try to connect the dots and make sure that those resources get in, thereby reducing their stress and improving their well-being and resilience.
So, Gulda, when it comes to emergencies, how would you, in this context, define an emergency, and who would declare an emergency? What does that mean exactly?
The federal government is the one who actually declares the emergencies and send in fundings, but the declaration can come from anybody. The declare seems to be so legal in its concept. But if a disaster strikes, remember, a disaster is something that you don't expect. An emergency similarly, right? You're not expecting it. Something occurs outside of the realm of what you're thinking of. Think about COVID as a disaster. And that was a huge disaster for our community. Not only, and if you step back from that, and we're going to have another one, by the way. And people like Dr. Prem, Mr. Gilliam, what we're doing right now is to help to prevent, to mitigate, to reduce the impact of it. So a disaster strikes is something that you're not expecting. You need resources to assist you with, right? And this is when you go outside of what you have to get that support. When the disaster strikes, the federal government will be the one to say this is a declaration. The mayor, the governor may ask for assistance, and the government is able to provide whatever resources they have. But in our community, and I want us to understand this in the biggest context, especially around our workforce and around our HBCUs. In 1860, Congress passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, and the act declared that all states should have an academic institution that includes the mechanic arts and agriculture. In 1890, when they came back to look at their investment, they found that only one academic institution allowed Black people to come to it. Then the decision was either build new institutions or allow Blacks to come to these institutions. In 1900, there were 4,500 Black people, students at HBCUs. The HBCUs that were built in disaster-prone areas. We're talking about what is an emergency. When it floods near to the railways, near to Superfund sites, our academic institutions are housed in these places. Talk about a disaster when it rains. We've been living with this forever. So when you talk about disaster, some people may think of something huge. It's just a big trauma, as Dr. Prim talked about, that our students have to go through. When it rains, will my classroom flood? When it rains, what else is coming down here, right? So that's what a disaster is. And it always is an emergency when it rains.
You know, it's interesting when you think about, let's say, natural disasters. And we have seen quite a few over the past 30 years or so. We have seen fires, we have seen floods, we have seen hurricanes, and the like. And I think Joe Gulda put an interesting point on this when you talk about people coming into communities of color in the aftermath, as opposed to in the immediacy of this. And this is why I bring that up. 1992, I was in South Florida for Hurricane Andrew, just the day after. And hurricanes, no color. Earthquakes, no color. Flooding, knows no color. And as we saw, for example, in Hurricane Katrina, yes, the Coast Guard was rescuing Black people out of attics, off of rooftops. But, and so some people might say, well, why does this have to be a culturally competent issue, Joe? Because we've seen the videos, and we've seen, governmental agencies, particularly the military, come in and address this. But we're not talking about the day of. What are the risks in the days and weeks after?
That's a good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. The average person only understands disasters from the news cycle. The news cycle will only show the first phase of everything. So after 30 days, you might have a report quarterly as to, what has been done since the day of the event. And what a lot of people don't realize is it's a very long process. And during that process, that's where some of the politics get involved, to be honest. I just want to be honest, because the resources are filtered through politics. That's just what it is. Unfortunately, underserved communities, Black communities, minority communities, of traditionally how we approach politics, we normally approach it, in my opinion, a high percentage through the church. So we get our direction and some of our moral from the church, whereas some of the other communities, they use that other mechanism in order to operate. And when a disaster happens, they're already in place with the relationships to get what's needed. Because the example I used before was, if I have resources and something happens to zip code where I know I have 10 family members, I'm going to say something to someone I know, hey, could you make sure that they get X, Y, Z? Not saying anything, not putting a specific number, but just pointing the resources in that direction. So it is about relationships. And I think the key is developing these relationships in advance, part of the planning, so that when it does happen, we're not operating in silos. We're operating together and go, okay, like you said, hurricanes do not, and events do not address communities based on color or background. It's just geographic. So we have to have that. We have to have that balance in place, those relationships in place, so that there is fair representation. That's going to be the key. Fair representation allows the same type of favor done for people who are not of color, for the same favoritism for people of color. But now that we know we're all in the same room, we know what's available. So you can't make too many, for lack of better terms, backdoor deals. Everything has to be transparent, and that allows a fair amount of support, and not based on any other type of systemic racism.
And now I'll ask you about this, because I only have about a minute before the break, but we'll talk about more of it on the other side. You said your organization was started in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. Just kind of briefly talk about the long-term impact on mental health for those who lost their homes, not just lost their homes, but had to leave their home city, their home state. Real quick before I take a break, your initial thoughts about that.
So people who were harmed by Katrina or were displaced by Katrina, they still experience a sense of grief and loss 20 years later. And in some cases, for those who were displaced, the loss of being a part of, the community and social fabric, that for the, New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, so much of the culture is embedded in those communities in which they lived. And so it's a huge loss, and there's still a lot of grieving and really like a post-traumatic experience of reliving that. So
hold that point, if you will.
yes.
Don't forget what you're going to say. I'm going to take a really quick break. Don't forget, you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. This conversation on emergency preparedness continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about being prepared in the event of a natural disaster. My guests are Dr. Anel Prim, co-founder and chair of All Healers Mental Health Alliance, Joe Gilliam, founder of Unity in Disasters Incorporated, and Dr. Gulda Downer, founder of the HBCU Emergency Management Workforce Consortium. Before the break, Anel, you were talking about kind of the long-term mental health effects of someone not just losing their home, but indeed losing their home city, their home state in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and how they are still dealing with it some 20 years later. Please continue your point.
Yes, I think, when for those people who had to leave New Orleans, for instance, or the Gulf Coast and be relocated elsewhere, they lost their sense of rootedness and the culture that's so much a part of their lives, their social fabric ends up being disrupted. So not only was the storm a trauma in and of itself and everything that happened, but those are the additional losses that surround it, that just compound the grief and the sadness and the sense of trauma, and also how they were treated in the process. Sometimes the disregard and the some of the negativity of how people were looked upon and viewed who were just trying to survive. Those all really add to a really negative experience, and it really has an effect on mental health and well-being.
Let's talk about some really foundational things. We are now in hurricane season, and we may be in the DMV, we may be impacted, but certainly perhaps not like some other places have been historically. But with climate change and the like, we just don't know how severe we may be impacted in the weeks and indeed years moving forward. And I'll ask you this, Joe, but whoever perhaps has some foundational tips, what does a family need to have? What needs to be in that box in the basement or that emergency preparedness bag?
Okay, I'll start off, but I'm sure my colleagues will piggyback on it.
Sure.
Really, what's important is a copy of documentations, birth certificate, driver's license, all those important documents. A copy of them, a hard copy, and a digital copy. The other thing that's important is to take pictures in advance, because that's going to help with insurance, whether it be your vehicle or your property. Taking those pictures, it shows your valuables. It could be whatever you deem valuable. You take a picture of. The other thing you need is your medications, of course. Just it's not a survival mode, but you just have to change your mind, be under the mindset that things are not going to be convenient for about 7 to 14 days. What am I going to need to make it through this inconvenience for 7 to 14 days? And we don't know what that's going to be. It could be power, it could be getting around different places. So medications, documentations, digital and hard copy, and also if having a digital copy electronically, not just on a thumb drive, because if you lose it at your home and your house gets flooded, then that digital copy is gone. So it has to be digital to where it's not access to whatever that event was in your local area. I'll mention that and let my colleagues go ahead and piggyback off of it.
Gulda, do you have any thoughts?
Mm-hmm. And I also want to say what Annette said a while ago, that the devastation that occurred in New Orleans, people didn't just lose their homes, they lost a piece of themselves. And that, I think, is what is also part of the trauma, the mental health trauma. But Joe, I'll add to that by saying, I did a study in DC to find out if they knew if a disaster occurred here, where to get their medication, the HIV medication in particular, because you need to continuously take your medicine so that you don't, spread the disease or become ill. And they didn't know. So where the physicians are, they need to be able to be aware of that. Another thing that's important is also to have cash. Small bills, not large bills, because you may pay for something with $100, they don't have any change, your $100 are gone, right? Make sure you have that. Your canned goods. The American Red Cross said only 1 in 10 Americans, when asked, were prepared for disaster. And they recommended that you have 3 days worth of food. Now, some of us don't have food for today. We're not having 3 days worth of anything. But if we can't start collecting canned goods and have can openers to go with them, those are always important. And water. Always want
manual can openers. Manual can openers.
Not electric ones. You definitely need to have a change of clothing is always important, and always a contact list. Individuals who we can reach out to and contact with. That is so important. Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you about this, and it's so funny that we're having this conversation today because I was watching television this morning, and there was a commercial that talked about what to do about power in the event of a natural disaster if you lose power. And I'm not talking about, obviously, if your home is destroyed, but if there is something that takes out power, there is a storm and you don't have power for 3 or 4 or 5 days, and they were advertising one of those power units, the big blocky things, and I remember the guy said, well, they're only $280 a month. I don't know how long that's for. Is that for a year, 2 years? We have financing, blah blah blah. So obviously these things are not cheap, but what the advertisement was suggesting is that these contraptions, these items, will power your home for the next 3 to 5 days or what have you if your community loses power. I guess my question is, and anyone can answer this if you have an opinion about it, is it you don't need it until you need it? Is it worth it to do that? I've lost power to my house for a day. It was inconvenient. Did I need one? No, I just stuck it out. But it sure would have been nice to turn that thing on and have the power. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, if you have medical equipment,
please jump right in, people.
If you have medical equipment that you need, something to keep you alive, I think that would be something to consider. And also, if you have solar, that may help. Let me add one piece that often is overlooked in terms of what you need. You need condoms. People are sexually active during disasters, and that's a way of...
Wait a minute. Did you say condoms?
Yes. We need condoms. We need to make sure that if people are still being sexually active, that they're doing it in a safe way and not spreading diseases. That's something that is often overlooked, and it's an important component to your safety kit.
I guess okay.
I'm in the healthcare field, and my
yes, exactly. I'll take
HIV. So we don't want to.
No, I get it. I guess that's just.
Think about it.
No, because maybe if I was 21, maybe I don't know, but and I say that only slightly tongue in cheek, but I'm thinking in the event of a real disaster,
Mhm.
um,
And some people
yes,
want to feel connected. People want to feel connected with a trauma and they want to feel connected again. So, that's part of just being an adult and being a responsible one, I might add. We don't want any more HIV or anything else.
I see. Okay, what
One
else
of the
goes
other
in that? Go ahead.
one of the other things, Harold, that I want to emphasize is really important. It's really a mindset. I think people have to have a mindset of preparedness because you can't cover all scenarios. You just can't. But I think it's the mindset, and it's a community mindset. We were started off of the diagram, which I call the cluster of support, meaning that the neighborhood understood. Well, let me back up. I put together a daycare disaster plan for daycares, so
Okay.
that daycare centers knew that the parents knew the best routes to go based on where the event was, the evacuation, how to pick their kids up. They knew how to contact that daycare center, whether it be by social media. They had the director's phone cell number. The driver of the van had a copy of all the information in the vehicle. Each daycare center knew where the closest facility that had a generator and the closest facility that had first aid help, fire department or clinic. Little thoughts of that nature collectively for community is how we survive this. It's based on how we look at things. The community is responsible for the community. And I think the mindset is really what's going to make us think outside the box and go, hey, let's just, like they talked about, community hubs is one thing that's come up a lot lately, but it's the same concept. We have to realize that when something happens, we need to operate more like how can the community take care of itself until then. So if my neighbor down the street has a generator, I don't need one. I go down to the street and say, hey, can you warm up my daughter's milk?
Mhm.
Or it's hot outside, can we come inside and get some air for a while? But you have to have that mindset of the community. What are we going to do in this 4-block radius if we have no power for 4 months? And try to start thinking and behaving along those lines with the frequency of events, because it's not just hurricanes and it's not just fires. We have regular rain that's flooding out neighborhoods.
Yeah. Anybody have any
And
thoughts
can I
about my
add to that,
question
Joe? That is
about?
perfect. Yes.
I was going to ask. Anybody
Can
have
I
any
add to
thoughts
that?
about my? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, because what Joe just talked about the community, there's something called a community emergency response training that encourages communities to get together. And the government does this. I'm actually going to be taking one next week, or I should say a refresher course. It's light rescue, what the community needs to do, basic disaster training for the community. Everybody can take it. And what it does, it allows us to know, for example, when a disaster strikes, when the professionals cannot come in our community, we can take care of ourselves until the experts come in. But everybody's on the same page. We are all doing a community training, and we're able to not only stop fires, do a little bit of rescue, but support each other. And I think that's where the community can come together. The government has such a program. And one of the things we're asking our HBCUs to also do is to make sure that all of our students do the community emergency response training, because it brings us up and it's a stepping stone into the emergency workforce planning space.
Mhm.
Is there
So,
something to start? Mhm.
so let me. Before I go back to Anel,
Mhm.
anybody have any thoughts about buying a generator? I mean, that was my question, and I got crickets. I mean,
We're ignoring you.
I mean,
I mean,
buying a generator is a good idea if you are able to. They do cost a lot.
Mhm.
And so if one can afford it, absolutely, because it helps your, all the basic things that you rely upon, refrigeration for food. And I'll just note that in some disasters, when the power goes out, people lose all their food. I mean, sometimes they have freezers full of food, and that's a huge loss, which, in some cases they're able to get reimbursed for. So if you can prevent, the whatever the extent that you can prevent or protect yourself from disasters, like with a generator, I I recommend that if people are able. But I think being realistic, people need to, as Joe mentioned, to think collectively, to think village. Sometimes we have to share. And if somebody in the community has a generator, then maybe they can take some of the food to keep it cold. And, people have to work together. And especially if they're not able to afford a generator.
Mm. And now I want to ask you also a highly specific question as it relates to mental health and natural disasters. Because I used to wonder, and I guess this could apply to New Orleans, but it also would apply to other places that are prone to hurricanes, like South Florida, or flooding, such as North Alabama. And I remember, and I can't remember the name of it, unfortunately, but there's a community in North Alabama where all of the houses are raised at least a story or a story and a half on wooden platforms, because every single year for generations there was flooding, and so they learned to adapt instead of moving. And I just wonder, from your opinion, as an outsider, I would often say, why would you live in a place that was prone to be destroyed every single year? And even those of you who prepared for this, living on stilts, for lack of a better term, I can't imagine what that does to someone's psyche. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think we have to understand that when people are from a certain community, they are tied to it. And we might, be on the outside making judgments about,
Right.
well, maybe you should move so that if that happens again, you won't be in harm's way. But people are tied to the land. Sometimes, for generations, their people have been there. And my dad even went through a disaster, and we wanted him to leave his home, but he kind of wanted to go down with the ship, because that was his place. So I think we have to honor and understand how people are very tied, to their homes, to their communities, to the land. And it may be hard to understand why they won't leave, because we may know of the dangers and know of the risks. But sometimes those ties and bonds really outweigh, in that person's mind, the risks. And, I don't see it as being a mental health concern at all.
Well, not even so much as a mental health concern, so much as, when, and I think you explained it in very, very well, and the emotional ties to the land. Sometimes when we talk about mental health, that doesn't always mean that there's a deficit. Sometimes it just that there is a state or a mindset that doesn't suggest illness or deficit or anything. This is, like you said, this is what you know. And this is where you are happiest, even in unhappy times. And so I think that was a great illustration. I did want to ask Joe about something that you did touch on earlier, because I would argue that now more than ever, and when I say now, not just 2025, but I would say over the past 15 years or so, we have seen the role that politics has played in disaster aid. For example, in Western Maryland, during the storms this early summer, where the communities there, mostly white, were not helped by the federal government because Maryland is a blue or even purple state, or you have a blue governor. But you may remember back with Hurricane Sandy, President Obama went to New Jersey and shook hands with Chris Christie, who was a Republican, and President Obama said at the time this wasn't about a blue or red state, this was about American people. But then we also saw last year that people in Western North Carolina, when flooding, the devastating flooding, happened there, and there were all of these cuts to FEMA or reorganizations and the like. And this kind of goes back to what, Goulda was saying, cultural competence. North Carolina Hill Country, where people, because of their political beliefs, didn't want the government to come in and help them. And again, Joe, I just find that, fascinating as a person who would like to think the best, that when people are in trouble, that you would hope that these notions of political leanings and color would go out the window. But I guess the reality is that ain't happening.
Good point. And that's exactly when I first founded Unity in Disasters, I was trying to come up with something that made sense as part of the solution. And that was the common denominator. We have the ability to do, and we have the ability to help. We're just not willing to come together on one accord to do it. And I guess it's almost like there are conditions with it. But you mentioned the politics. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, when COVID struck, I watched how the politics of the vaccine played out the same way the resources for disasters played out. Mm-hmm. All resources get filtered through the top down to the bottom. So unfortunately, between human nature and just the nature of helping people, we live in a cruel world. That's all I can say. We live in a really cruel world. And the sooner that we realize that, I think the better we can prepare. When we realize that FEMA is not coming, as soon as our psyche tells us that, we'll start behaving and planning differently. But as long as we believe that FEMA is coming, we're going to pause. We're going to hide money underneath the counter. We're going to do all these other diversions and other things that are going to happen because we believe something that's not true. So the point with politics, we just have to start believing, see the writing on the wall. The truth is the truth. It's going to show itself, and we have to start functioning as a community and put together some of the old, put aside some of the old issues that have divided us, and realize that we're almost on our own. We're almost on our own. As soon as we realize that the Black community, like any time else, when we come together, we're unstoppable, and we can survive. But we have to just realize that is the way it's going to be done by us being together, realizing no one's coming to save us, and that we can do this.
Yes, go right ahead, Anel, please.
I wanted to give an example. You mentioned Western North Carolina and All Healers Mental Health Alliance, working with the Black Resilience Network that we are a part of. We have established a Asheville Women's Support Group. And Asheville is in Western North Carolina, hit very hard by Hurricane Helene. And this support group has been going on since November of 2024, bringing women from Asheville into a healing space where they could share what they had been through with Hurricane Helene, how it devastated their community, and they could share and also exchange information about different resources. So, that's an aspect of how it was important in the aftermath of that disaster to create such a space that could be healing and supportive, and it could be a place where information could be exchanged on what were some of the unmet community needs and resources that had been overlooked and bypassed, like what both Joe Gilliam and Dr. Goulda Downer have mentioned. So that's just an example of the sorts of things we can do driven by the community there, what it is that they want and need. And so we are led by them in making sure that such a space exists and continues.
Gulda, I'll let you have a final word. What is it that you believe we have not learned since Hurricane Katrina that we should learn?
I think my colleague said it, that we need to come together and that we can. When I think of COVID and how we were so negatively impacted, and we were able to work with 42 HBCU students. We had the COVID Awareness and Testing Day. And together, they made sure that the community in which the HBCUs were anchored learned and knew about COVID testing, how to protect themselves, the vaccination, how to get it, when and where and why, and how the students still, they didn't have laptops, but they were able to use their phones. They didn't have Wi-Fi. They went and sat beside the police stations, the municipal government stations. They didn't have tables and desks in their homes, but they used ironing board. These are the resilience of our young folks. They are the indomitable spirits of the ancestors were with them, and they all graduated. And they were able to safeguard the health of not just the students at the HBCUs, but the communities in which the HBCUs are anchored. We have learned a lot, but we have to learn more how to get together. We don't need a disaster to bring us to our knees. We need to start planning now so that when things happen, as Mr. Gilliam just said, we can just roll with the ball because we are prepared. That's what preparedness means for us. And we've got to get it done.
Dr. Annelle Prim, Dr. Gulda Downer, and Joe Gilliam, thank you all so much for sharing your insight and your tips and advice. So important, because the natural disaster season, at least for hurricanes, is just upon us, but there are other kinds of disasters that could impact us year round. So thank you all so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That is the Daily Drum for this Monday, September 8th. I'm Harold Fisher.